Hi, I'm Lasse. I work for Reactor, and I think we just half an hour ago launched a satellite. So that's cool. But I'm a programmer. I have nothing to do with satellites. I usually work with mobile apps, moving bits and pieces back and forth from a database of some kind, maybe on a device, maybe on a network, and draw pretty things on screen and so forth. But not every time we have the luxury of actually working with designers like Trevor. Sometimes we get weird echoes, and sometimes we're sort of left on our own devices, just trying to make do without professional designers. And with facing this problem here and there, working for small teams with fairly constrained budgets usually, it's something that we faced here and time and again and try to sort of solve. And what bothered me was that there's a whole shelf full of design literature in the bookstore, but very, very little of it is actually something that's objective. It's very subjective. A lot of it is about opinions. If you read the whole book, you actually find something that contradicts the previous opinions and so forth. So I sort of started collecting these rules of design, which is tongue-in-cheek. I'm not claiming that these are the absolute rules. It's more like rules of thumb. And just to make sure, maybe there's a language barrier, that was the disclaimer that says, do not hold me accountable for what I say. Okay, so let's start with a simple example. So here's a rule about shadows. Light should be natural. There's something wrong with one of these examples, and there's the correct version on the right. Can anyone spot the difference? Yeah, the sign up button. It's wrong. So first of all, light does come from above. So this is a very small thing. I'd say most people don't even realize it. But if you show this to a designer, they'll spank you with the mobile phone they're testing with. And so first of all, make sure that light comes from above unless you have a very good reason to do something else. And second, be consistent. So if you look at the bottoms on the top, they're sort of natural, but the sign-up button seems like it's sort of embedded. It's pushed into the canvas. So it's different. Okay. Lines. If you look at your UI, there's probably a bunch of lines if you start looking at the sort of edges of different elements. And my suggestion is that lines should be 1 pixel wide, or 1 point wide, 1 dp wide, however you define it. That's just how it seems. So if you look at the examples again, that's 2 pixels versus 1, I think. And the 2 pixel lines just seem awkward. So usually thinner is better. There might be good reasons to use wider lines, thicker lines, but again, these are rules of thumb, and this example is to show that if you're in a rush, you don't really know which of these two is better. You can't make up your mind. The rule of thumb says the thinner is better. So let's go with that. Also, dividers. So if you have a line that sort of divides, let's say, a list view elements or UI table view elements, those lines should rarely be very strong. So they're meant to be subtle hints, not very distinct. So go with a soft contrast, usually not pure black, also usually not pure white. And the difference here in these examples is that the left-hand side has pure black on white background or a light background. That looks off. the right-hand side example, it's not the prettiest, I would say, but it has a pure black divider on a dark background, which is better. It still looks a bit awkward, I think, but it's better. So if you if you have a dark background and you're looking at a divider color, go with a slightly lighter divider than the background color. That's my suggestion. So I'm not sure if you saw the difference, but now the dividers are a bit lighter on a dark background. Cool. Then let's talk a bit more about color. And thanks for the troll, by the way. So I'm not actually sure why, but some designers have been telling me that black shouldn't usually be black because there's no such thing as pure black in the nature. And so, therefore, why use pure black in UIs? I'm not actually sure if I agree to this rule, but I've heard it from so many sources that I sort of included it. But there's a sort of a different angle to it that I do kind of agree, which is that if you have a gray or black, almost black or dark gray or something color like this, it often makes it a bit more lively if you add a touch of color. A slight hue in barely noticeable terms tends to make it nicer to look at. So here we have pure black on the left and very, very, very dark gray on the right. Here's a slightly lighter gray, and on the right-hand side you have a touch of color. So it's barely noticeable on my screen. I'm not sure if it's at all noticeable on the projector, but small things might make a difference with your designer's eye when he gets to see this. So add a touch of color. Now here's the twist. When it comes to white, off-white often looks dirty. So while pure black is unnatural, pure white is also unnatural, but it also very easily turns to dirty. So if you're sort of wondering whether this should be slightly off-white or pure white, it's probably safer to go white, all white. Try and see for yourself, but if you're unsure, pure white is, at least it looks clean. Okay. So then about contrast. So this is very much related to accessibility, but I'll just sort of skip over accessibility in general. I'm definitely not an expert on that. But just looking at people with sort of regular vision, which means bad vision, some of these color combinations are easier to read, more legible than others. And for example, just by looking at this sort of pure red and blue, for example, I initially thought that the red would be easier to read than the blue one. That was my initial sort of subjective opinion when I look at these colors, white text on the color. But then it turns out there's this actual standard or recommendation by the W3 organization. So in their web content accessibility guidelines, they actually define a suggested algorithm how to calculate contrast ratio. And they have these recommendations that for text at a certain size, what's the minimum contrast ratio you should have to be considered sufficiently accessible for vision, let's say people with worse vision than maybe the average. And so based on that algorithm, the blue is actually much, much better. The ratio is almost actually it's more than twice the contrast ratio of the white on red. And this is actually, this was surprising to me because my eyes were clearly lying. And so it might not be enough to just rely on your eyes if you have good vision or if you see the colors nicely. You might want to actually check the color combinations that you're using, especially related to text, because text is something that we need to actually read. It's not just visual imagery to sort of make it look nicer. It's the actual substance, the content that you want people to read and understand. So you might want to check. There are tools like contrastchecker.com you can use. There's the git.io URL points to a small snippet of code I wrote in Swift, I think. You could actually automate a lot of this. Like if you're running a debug build, on any screen, shake your phone and it just traverse through all the UI hierarchy and grab text elements, their foreground, background, and run the calculations and flag anything that's not enough contrast. Might not be that bad an idea. But also, regarding the use of colors, again, fewer colors tends to be better. So, for example, here's two examples from an app I was working on. The left-hand side has basically 3 highlight colors and the white on black. And then the right-hand side, which we actually did implement, just has 1 highlight color and then white and black, or almost black. So I'm not going to touch on color palettes. There's a bunch of tools like color.adobe.com that you can use to sort of run through color palettes. And there's a bunch of ways you can try and pick a color palette. But usually, even if you don't have a full-time designer, you usually have a brand, an existing brand to work with, and more often than not, in my experience, you're basically handed out a set of highlight colors to pick from. So I'm just going to skip over selecting palettes. So here's a few examples from apps you might know. The left-hand side, that's, I think, hotels.com. So it looks a bit busy, but it only has 4 colors, which I think you should consider pretty much the maximum to have. They sort of make it work, but it could be better, I think. Then there's Foursquare with 3 colors. There's Booking.com with 3 colors as well. Then there's Airbnb with just 2 colors. And the winner here is Starbucks with just 1 highlight color plus black and white and different shades of gray. So the fewer colors, the safer. The more likely it actually looks good. Now the trick is the fewer colors you use, the more you have to use other effects to establish visual hierarchy and to make the UI legible, to help the actual human being understand what the programmer meant, what these elements are, which of them are actionable, which of them are just ink, and so forth. So let's talk about images. My first rule is if you don't control the images, don't put text on them. So basically the challenge is that if you don't know what pixels are going to be lined up with the text, you don't really know whether there's enough contrast. So white text on a mostly white image, totally unreadable. White text on a very colorful image, Might be legible, might not be. But whatever you do, if you insist on laying text over an image, at least stick to white or black on the image if you're using color images. There's only very few cases where it looks good to have colored text on top of a colored image. And I haven't seen a single case where the image wouldn't be hand-picked, curated, basically controlled. So just stay away from colored text and be safe. So if you do decide, against my recommendation to lay text over an image, there are some ways you can sort of improve legibility. One is to go very big. So the bigger the font, the bigger the more volume of ink. If you imagine how much ink did you put on this canvas, the more ink, the more legible, generally. So use a bold cut in fonts, a big size in points, and that might be enough. So here the title Viceland is clearly legible, but if you look at the tagline, it's a TV channel, it's not that legible anymore. Another way to do this would be to add a tint of some kind of color on the image. This is from the meetup.com app. And for some images it works, but again, these are not controlled images. They're images uploaded by the meetup organizers. So you either have to apply a very, very strong tint and maybe some other effects as well, or risk being still not that readable. The Brooklyn Swift Developers Group on the right, slightly better. The iOS Soho meetup, not so good. You could also dim the image. So here on the left-hand side, I think that's Showtime. Showtime is basically applying a translucent black or dark layer on top of the image, which makes the white text pop up a bit more. But it also sort of dampens or lowers the vibrancy of the image. So the images don't look that good anymore. So the effect kind of works, but it has a clear downside. Starbucks does the same. So they dim their images, which makes the coffee look less delicious. But then again, you're already hooked, so it doesn't matter so much. But you can also use a gradient layer, which makes the problem of images not looking good a bit less. So here's BBC on the left. They're actually applying a slightly tilted gradient, which is actually pretty hard to see in the image. So the top of the image is completely without a dimming layer, and the bottom left, I think, is where the gradient starts. So they make sure that the text, which they know is sort of laid out on the bottom of the image, it tends to be legible. And then the top is kind of left untouched. So when you're using gradients, there's again a bit of a risk. Because if you don't control the image, you might get an image that has a big solid white or light color area. And if you put a gradient on top of a solid area, it's going to look bad, especially or depending a bit on the screen quality. But if you're working, for example, on a TV OS app, let's say, your TV doesn't do as good a job as your iPhone, for example. So the gradient that looks good on your Mac, that looks good on your iPhone, it no longer looks good on your Samsung TV. You see clear banding and So you should probably test with the actual screens you're using. On the right-hand side, that's another example from Airbnb. They also use a gradient layer. I can't see and I can't remember whether it's tilted or not, whether it's straight up and down or at a slight angle. But it kind of works anyway. The images are not quite as dim as the Showtime app on the previous slide. Another trick is to box the text. So if you limit the dimming effect to just the boundaries of the text element, it might actually be a good compromise. So you make the text legible, don't dim the image too much, and you're not trying to trick the eye to think that there's no gradient. Just being honest, we don't control the images. We don't know what color the background is going to be, so we're just going to do this. Or you can go all the way to an opaque, non-transparent layer and just box your text properly. Not that it's necessarily better than the others, but definitely an option to consider. Right. Another trick you might want to try is text shadow. Now this is an interesting effect because I once had it. I think we fought with a designer for 2 days whether we should or shouldn't use text shadow, and basically the designer didn't want the text shadow because it doesn't look as good. But then on different devices, we had trouble making the text pop enough. We also didn't want to go to these gradient layers or dim the image. And so we basically tweaked these different parameters for a while, for a couple of days, and then we said, okay, let's go text shadow, which you often use on top of one of the other techniques. Either a dimming layer or a gradient, just to make the text pop up slightly more. Also, if you go online and Google for how does Google Maps make the labels stand out from the actual map elements, they do something similar but even more advanced. So they're actually looking at the text and the tile contents. So they're not using text shadow, they're not using text borders, they're doing something kind of a mix of everything, calculating which pixels do we want to add around the text to make it legible. So they're going very, very advanced with this, but just plain text shadow might work for, let's say, most cases. But again, if you really want the best results, just stay away from overlaying text over images. Either control the images and make sure that before you publish the image or the content, make sure that the image looks good with the text, or use one of the sort of safe techniques like boxing the text, like Wiseland does on the right-hand side. On the mobile layout, Wiseland actually does box the text. They don't even try to overlay it on the image. They just go safe. For some reason on the iPad, they feel like it's more okay, probably because the actual physical size is bigger than on a mobile. Cool. Then a few words about layout. There's a bunch of stuff on the screen. This is from a Finnish TV, like the Finnish version of Netflix for the biggest commercial provider. So don't mind the content and the weird words, but just pay attention to the gaps or the grid. So initially this kind of looked fine for me. Then I started looking at it a bit more, a bit more detail. I'm not sure where or how, but at some point I started scanning UIs. So if I look at a UI, usually something that I'm developing, I sort of start scanning from left to right with my eyes and imagine like a grid line moving. And if I see elements that are almost aligned but not quite, that sort of starts bothering me. And so when we do that, we can see that there's a bunch of problems here. The red lines are so these sort of alignment lines where you have one or more elements lined up, left aligned along that edge. And if you look at the hamburger menu on top, that's, for example, it's not quite on the grid. So that's seems a bit off. If you look at the Ruutu logo, the blue logo on the top left corner of the images, that's also slightly off from the grid. It didn't bother me as much without these grid lines overlaid, but the hamburger menu actually did bother me. So there's another problem, and that's that when you have these grid lines, like you had on the left-hand side, you have 4 grid lines very closely backed or bunched together. That's starting to become a problem. So if you look at these sort of lines and you see maybe 4 is the maximum, I don't know, 5 would definitely be worse. But if you have too many lines close together, that's probably a warning sign you should pay attention to, because that might be a fairly dense UI, maybe look a bit chaotic. So let's fix that too. Moving the elements so that they're aligned, widening the sort of info box, the yellow alert, so that it's sort of as wide as the text content inside that card. That reduces the number of grid lines we have. Now there's a maximum of 3. Everything's aligned. It's safer. Not too many grid lines together. Probably better than before. So mind the gap. There's some other rules. You might have different numbers in mind, but I think a fairly safe claim would be that rarely the grid line should be narrower than 8 pixels wide. 8 pixels, 10 pixels, that's usually the dominating opinion in a team. And also, if you have gaps that are, or grid sections that are roughly similar size, just make them identical, just to be safe again. So it's totally fine to have different sizes of elements on the screen. That's natural. But if they're almost the same size, just make them same size. So then there's text. This is probably the let's say biggest topic for me personally, because it took a long time before I started even sort of being aware of laying out text and typographical issues. So let's start by text effects. Again, the fewer, the better, generally. So we want to establish hierarchy, but overdoing it looks clumsy very easily. So usually it's enough to have just one emphasis increasing effect. Like if you go with a bold, slightly slanted, underlined title, that's at least one effect too much. Usually just adding one emphasis increasing effect is enough. Like here we have, on the right-hand side, we have a bigger size and, as a second effect, a slightly bolder cut of the font. On the other hand, mixing sort of emphasis increasing and emphasis decreasing effects might be okay. So if you make the font a lot bigger and then the cuts lighter, it might actually still look very good. Sometimes it might actually make the hierarchy clearer than just adding slightly on multiple effects. So experiment with that if you feel like that's something to do. Might look good. But the important thing is that when you have these two kinds of elements, let's say title and body, they should look different. So try to establish visual hierarchy. Some techniques you have seen, like text size, color, the cut, how much ink on the font, and so forth. Here's an example where color is actually kind of a problem. So on the left-hand side, that's the actual screenshot from the Starbucks app, and it has this red cross because there's not enough visual hierarchy between the name of a product and the sort of metadata, the calories of the product. That's my opinion, but there you go. Not enough contrast between the two elements. And on the right-hand side, we've emphasized the difference by making the metadata, the secondary information, with lower contrast, so darker color makes the titles pop up more. Then again, now we have the problem of the calories not really being legible against the black background, but we can fix that, tune it a bit more, back and forth until you find something that's a suitable balance. There's a whole bunch of rules, and some of them are sort of pushing you in different directions. So try to look for a good balance. Then there's the font size. So here's again a rule of thumb. The font size for a title should be 1.5 times the font size of the body. You can go up and down a bit, and it still looks fine, probably. But if you're not sure, just go with 1.5, and you should be safe. At first, I thought that the left-hand side is way too big, but if you go to smaller font sizes, it becomes a bit more important. At large font sizes, you can get away with a lot of things, but when you go small, it becomes more important. You can also, again, play with the different text effects. So if you add another emphasis increasing effect, the difference in bodies, the font size doesn't have to be 1.5, and it's still equally legible or equally distinguished between the title and the body. So try mixing effects. Might make it actually more a better visual hierarchy than just the title font size. Also 1.5 line height. So this is a bit tricky to do in code. I think still kind of impossible to do in interface builder, at least in iOS. But when you lay out a lot of text that is supposed to be red, so I'm not talking about the like mocha latte or something like this, but more like an abstract for a text-based content or the actual content body itself. Make sure that the line height is big enough, because if that's not working too well. Oh, this is working better. So if the line height is too cramped, it's visually hard for your eyes to jump from one row to the next. So it makes it more difficult to read, your users are going to jump back to the beginning of the same line they just read. They're going to scan it again, jump again, and they're going to get frustrated because it's hard to follow the text. So 1.5, a pretty good rule of thumb. Here's an example that's too cramped. 1.2 gets more difficult to read. In the other direction, it's kind of easy to read, but it looks stupid. So just go with 1.5. Body font size, if you're not quite sure, 15 is pretty safe. Again, it probably looks too big if you have good vision. But if your users don't necessarily have that good vision, bigger is better usually. Also, a disclaimer, you should probably consider using dynamic type, or let's say not preventing the users from using dynamic type, so that they can actually control with their mobile phone settings how big your text is in the app. Here's some examples. I have some apps that I've made that do use 13-point font size, and I could read it easily on an iPhone. But then looking at my mom, for example, she just refuses to upgrade to a decent phone, and so her ancient Samsung just shit. So she can't actually read the text at 13 pixels, or 13 points actually. And for me, 11 points is where I start having trouble. And so it's kind of sad, but most programmers that I worked with, they rarely look at the apps they're working on in bright sunlight, for example. They're sitting in an office where they've already tuned so that whatever is on their screen, there's no reflections. They're using like a fairly high-end mobile device with a very good screen. The conditions are sort of perfect, and very rarely they actually go out and try to use their own products in bright daylight with all kinds of other distractions. So with text, bigger is better. Well, then let's talk about alignment. Just never ever center titles. Because the body text is anyway left aligned, or in some languages right aligned. Whatever the computer says, it doesn't look right. Even though it's pixel by pixel exactly centered, looking at it next to a left aligned section or paragraph, it's no longer centered. So just don't go there. Also, you might not want to center bodies either, because if you can't control the text, or even if you control the text, but you have a bunch of different sizes of screens, it will look bad at some point. Should I just use both?
No, use both. Yeah.
Okay. Awesome. I'm winning. Before this day, I probably spoke on one of these things like 5 times before. Now I go double. So let's see if I can do this. I need my freedom. Right. So if you don't control the text or the how wide it's going to be laid out, it's going to look stupid when you have these long lines and then 1 or 2 sort of overflowing words on the last line. So usually it doesn't look that good. Finally, you probably don't want to justify text either, because if the paragraph is narrow and you have long words, it creates ugly gaps. This is a bit specific to languages. Like German has ridiculously long words in actual sentences. You don't even have to go to Wikipedia to find the longest word there is. You can just pick up a random newspaper in German and you'll find words that are longer than 20 characters each. So there's this rule of thumb that if the body, the number of characters per line is less than 20 times the font size, it's probably going to look bad. So, again, it's just easier to avoid justifying the text altogether. English is a bit easier on this. English people need shorter words. That was a joke. But also, if the paragraph is too wide, or actually, if you call it wide, it's already too wide, because the wider the text, the harder it is to read. So this is already, I think, around 100 characters per line, I think. And the problem here is the longer the distance between the beginning and the end of the line, the harder it is, again, for your eyes to jump back to the beginning of the next line. You can battle this a bit by increasing line height, but again, very quickly it starts looking stupid. So it's probably better to look at multi-column layouts when you want to fill a wide area of space with text. Okay. And a few words about fonts. Does anyone recognize this? No, it's not Comic Sans. Can't remember the name, but it's not Comic Sans. So in general, I just flat out recommend using the native font, the default system font. They're actually pretty good fonts. San Francisco on iOS and Roboto on Android. They're the de facto standard anyway nowadays. And they look good on pretty much all the font sizes you have on a device. So I kind of like to think that it's not an accident that Apple and Google decided on these particular fonts. They work well on those screens. And on iOS, for example, San Francisco supports dynamic type. And if you want to go with a custom font, then you actually have to jump through hoops to support dynamic type. So it's all around easier if you go with the default font. But because, along with the color palette, the designer, before they left, they also told you which fonts to use, and they're not the defaults. So if you must choose something else, I would say the safest bet is to pick something that mentions sans in the name. Basically, that means there's no these endings on at the ends of the sort of strokes on a glyph. On a sans font, there's no endings on those glyphs. And then serif fonts have those endings. And so I'm just saying that generally it's easier or safer to use the sans serif fonts. But of course, there's you can make everything work. And so if you must use a serif font, my next suggestion would be to use it for actual content. If we look at examples, most of the apps you see that mix sort of serif and sans serif fonts, they use serif fonts only for text content, like title, body, but not for UI elements like buttons or sort of metadata like dates, when was this article published, things like that. Here are some examples. The Guardian uses serif fonts on everything, I think. It's been a while since I took the screenshots, but I'm pretty sure that the Guardian app doesn't actually have any text anywhere in their UI that uses a sans serif font. Then there's, I think the middle one is, it's CNN. They use all sans serif fonts, so no serif anywhere. And then on the right-hand side, that's New York Times. They kind of mix both. So they use serif fonts for content, but then the UI elements, like the navigation bar on top, it's all sans serif font. So you can pretty much make everything work, but if you're going to mix things, you need to make sure that you can actually distinguish the fonts enough. And if you go with an all serif font everywhere, just beware that for some elements that are native to the operating system, they're going to be the default system font anyway. So it might look a bit weird when you get an alert that's San Francisco, and then all of the other content in the app is something else. So if you're going to use or mix different fonts, just make them very different. Just like with grid lines, if they're almost the same but not quite, it's going to look a bit off. So make sure that if it is different, it's clearly different. We saw some examples of using text size and color and things like that to highlight or differentiate between different types of elements, establish the hierarchy. But with fonts, you can do the same kind of distinguishing using the different font styles. Pick fonts from totally different families with totally different kinds of shapes. So on the right-hand side, we have a very different title font from the body font, which helps distinguish the two. The left-hand side, I'm not saying that's bad, but it does require a fairly significant difference in font size and cut to make it different. Cool. So that's all for now. I hope these were inspiring in some way. I hope that you disagreed with some of these thinkings, because that makes for the interesting conversations. And so my intent with these rules has been that when I do not have the designer sitting next to me, I can go forward sort of relying on these rules and know that I'm mostly right, and whatever changes we're going to make when the designer comes around next time, they're going to be smaller rather than larger. So I hope this is helpful. Please come and chat to me about these things. I'm basically a programmer just like you, so I'd love to hear your experiences. Thank you.